Hello to everyone that is joining us today. Please keep in mind that this is a recorded session. Welcome to SAVEC's new webinar series that focuses on legal and financial aid during the pandemic for the South Asian community. I came up with this idea in the beginning of February this year because financial and legal aid are significant issues that have escalated during the pandemic for the South Asian community, and the community has questions and concerns that need to be addressed. In today's session, our guest speaker will focus on financial and legal assistance for businesses and business owners. More specifically, today's webinar will discuss the difference between financial and legal assistance, explain existing and new benefits that the government has provided for businesses, and talk about what benefits and support is specifically available to small business owners. We won't be able to address all questions in our 1 hour session today. Hence, it would be best that we do email follow-ups afterwards. So if anyone has questions, you guys can do an email follow-up with us. That being said, I would like to make it clear that this webinar will not be a source that provides financial or legal advice in any way. And I encourage that if you have a personal issue that you want to discuss, you follow up with the lawyer privately. I also kindly ask that everyone keeps their mics muted and respect the space and our guest speaker. I would now like to do a land acknowledgement before moving into our presentation for today. So the work of SAVEC and the Council of Agencies serving South Asians takes place on traditional indigenous territories of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the most recent, the territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, Toronto, the traditional Mohawk name of this area called Toronto, which means trees in the water, and its surrounding areas are still home to Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to meet, work, and play on this territory as settlers. We wish to express gratitude to Mother Earth and for the resources we are using, and honoring all the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who have been living on the line since time immemorial. We will take 30 seconds to settle this in, and then we will continue with our session today. Moving on towards our session today, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Sabah Khan from Sabah Khan Law. Sabah Khan is an employment and human rights lawyer who started her own practice last year after working at a Toronto employment and labor law firm. She advises employers and non-unionized employees on wide-ranging matters pertaining to the workplace, including termination, severance packages, reviewing employment contracts and other agreements, and human rights issues arising at work. Her aim in starting her own practice is to provide legal advice at affordable rates to clients with a keen interest in honesty, transparency, individualized care, and attention for each client, and strong communication. Welcome, Sabah.
Thank you so much, Nimra, and thank you so much to CASA for having me here today. It's my pleasure to be here. So without further ado, I guess we can get started with the presentation. Nimra is going to share her screen. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so just to introduce myself, so as Nimra mentioned, I have been practicing employment and human rights law exclusively for the last few years. So, the landscape with employment law issues has been changing ever so drastically. And at some point in the presentation, we will touch upon, some updates with respect to vaccinations and policies as such. However, to start off, we will talk a bit about legal and financial aid for small businesses, particularly in the context of the pandemic, as well as certain grants and funding that may have been available outside of the pandemic, so prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we can move on to the next slide. This is just a disclaimer, again, to just reiterate that none of what I will be talking about today constitutes legal advice. And this is because when we as lawyers provide legal advice, it's very specific and tailored to the individual's circumstances and their particular scenario. So for that reason, none of what I will be mentioning today can be taken as legal advice. If you do have a situation arising where you require legal services, I would recommend that you reach out to a lawyer so that they can provide advice that's catered to your individual circumstances. So legal and financial assistance, and we can move on to the fifth slide where we talk about legal aid in Ontario. We'll first start off by talking a bit about the definitions, because I often find that we use these terms colloquially, legal and financial assistance, but for the layperson, they may not fully understand what is actually meant by legal and or financial assistance in Ontario. So I wanted to talk a little bit about legal aid in Ontario and what that actually means. So to unpack that a little bit, it's a government program that assists low-income individuals in Ontario to receive legal representation and advice. And it's administered by this entity that's known as Legal Aid Ontario. So you may have come across, the acronym LAO or Legal Aid Ontario. It's in a nutshell, it's a nonprofit corporation that administers this funding to certain institutions or entities that provide legal aid to lower income individuals. To get into some sort of legal technical terms, it's covered under the Legal Aid Services Act 2020. That's the governing statute for legal aid in Ontario. Now, moving on to financial assistance, that pertains to business grants from the government, be it provincial or federal, in the form of a monetary amount, which does not have to be repaid, unless obviously it's a loan of some sort. But my presentation discusses grants, so government funding that's provided to small businesses in Ontario that doesn't necessarily have to be repaid. It may have some conditions that attach to it, depending on what kind of a grant it is, and we'll get into that in a bit more detail in a moment. But there may be some kind of conditional requirements or eligibility requirements, but for grants, you would not have to repay those. The purpose of these grants is to support specific causes and businesses. And as you'll come to know in my presentation, there is specific funding available to very specific sectors or segments of the population. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move on with the presentation. So the question then becomes, who qualifies for legal and financial assistance? And we can move on to the next slide in which I address that. So do businesses qualify for legal and financial aid? The short answer to the legal aid question is no. And for those of you who might be wondering why, it's because, as I mentioned, legal aid is meant for a very specific faction of the population, namely those who have little or no money left after they pay for basic necessities like food and housing. The assumption with running a business is that those individuals that are running businesses or are business owners are likely not vulnerable in that sense, from a financial standpoint, and they're likely not living on the brink, and aren't in the same boat as the individuals for which Legal Aid Ontario is provided. Some examples of people who could apply or who may be eligible for legal aid, just to kind of draw a comparison, would be individuals who are single parents seeking child support, those in abusive relationships or in domestic violence relationships, or parents seeking custody those that come from Indigenous backgrounds or people experiencing addiction issues. So this is just to draw a comparison to show why Legal Aid Ontario is not catered to small businesses. It's meant for a very specific segment of the population. However, financial aid, yes, businesses are eligible for financial aid, and we'll talk a little bit about what options might be available for small businesses in Ontario. So moving on to the pre-COVID situation for South Asian businesses and business owners. In the next few slides, we will address what the pre-COVID situation was for South Asian owned businesses when trying to access financial assistance. And just a small caveat, I know some of this, the discussion today should cater to South Asian businesses in particular, but my assessment is that the grants are kind of available to businesses at large, but there are specific grants that may cater towards minority groups such as women, women-owned businesses, or racialized minorities, someone racialized or coming from an ethnic background who is operating a business. So there are ways in which you can create filters to try and find grants that might be available specifically to you for your business needs. But generally speaking, most of the grants are available, and the sort of eligibility criteria is on the basis of what the industry is in terms of the business, what kind of business it is, and what the aim for the business is. And that'll start to make sense as we actually cover some of these grants. So moving on to the next slide, we come to talk about transfer payments in Ontario. So Transfer Payment Ontario is basically a system through which funding is available to small businesses throughout the year. And I actually had the benefit of working with the provincial government in the specific ministry that actually administers these grants to small businesses. So what it essentially is it's a program that has many different kinds of programs under it, and businesses in Ontario can apply for those grants by making a pitch to the government. So I've included a link below on the slide where you can, if you were to click on that link, you would be able to see all different types of funding that you may be you may be able to apply for and be eligible for as a business owner in Ontario. But the Transfer Payment Ontario system, you can use that portal. It's kind of like a portal. You have to create a login. You start off with that, and then you can get information about available funding opportunities. You can see which funds or which programs or grants are still open and accepting applications, which of those are closed, and you can actually check the status of your active submissions for funding. So I find it to be quite a useful portal. And moving on to the next slide, I've actually included, just to give you a sense of what it looks like, I've included a screenshot of what that page looks like and how many grants are available. So we can move on to the next slide. Yeah, there we go. Available funding opportunities from the Ontario government. So this is provincial. These are provincial grants. We'll get into the federal grants in a moment, but I just wanted you guys to see how many grants are available, and each of them have their own eligibility criteria. But and just to give you an example, if you look at number 24, and I'll read it out loud because I know it can be a little bit hard to read. It's Regional Development Fund, Regional Development Program for Eastern Ontario Development Fund and Southwestern Ontario Development Fund. So some of these programs, they cater to specific regions in Ontario, and that's because the aim for the government is to enhance development in those particular areas or to create jobs in those particular areas. And so they do that. One of the ways in which they do that is by creating these grants to provide to businesses so that they feel more encouraged to run a small business and to be more financially viable as a small business, because that in turn benefits the economy at large. So just in this list, you can see that there are over 30 programs just within Ontario for various industries and areas. Now, moving on to the next slide, I just wanted to kind of go over one of the funds. So this is the Ontario Together Fund. So if you click on any of the hyperlinks in the previous slide, you'll get to a page that looks like this on your screen, which is, it shows the deadline for the grant. It shows a description of, who might be eligible, what kind of funding is available, as you can see on the slide. So it'll say, this one provides funding to firms and organizations for projects that support either Ontario's ongoing response to the COVID-19 pandemic or Ontario's preparedness for future public health emergencies. And the types of funding available may include a conditional grant up to 75% of eligible project costs to a maximum of $2.5 million. So you can see that there's, this is just one example. There's so many other examples as we saw in the previous slide, but this is just to give you an idea of what the eligibility criteria might be and what you might be able to expect. Now, moving on to federal grants. So this is kind of, I find this tool actually very helpful. I think it's safe to say that a couple of years ago, government websites unfortunately weren't up to par with, just having, very functioning and easy to use websites. But I think they've made a huge jump, and it's been significant progress. So you can see here, this is a business benefits finder where you can actually include, there's a drop-down option for the fill in the blanks, and you can actually include your very specific details, specific to your own business. So you write, I'm looking for government support for my business specifically, and then there's another drop-down menu. My main goal is to, and then you can select a wide range of options from a wide range of options. I selected, just for the sake of giving you guys an example, grow and expand my business. And then there's actually another drop-down menu, and this is where, I guess that specific question about what's available to South Asian business owners kind of ties in. There is a section that says, and we're looking for programs that support businesses owned by, and then there's a drop-down menu. And as you can see, I've circled it in red. It says other racialized persons, formerly visible minorities. And then there's other sections, Black Canadians, Indigenous peoples, women, language minorities. So you may actually select, more than one category. That's totally fine on the finder. And so, yeah, so I really like this interactive page, and you can actually, once you go through the fill in the blanks and you hit OK, you can find grants according to your area of business, and specifically select programs that support businesses owned by, whatever category you would slot yourself in. And racialized persons, as I mentioned, are part of that list. Now, moving on to the next slide, here's an example of what that next page would look like if you were to hit those options. I kind of, when I filled in the blanks, I left it quite broad just to give you an example of how many grants are actually available. You can see there's 109 results, and there's so many, there's a huge list of grants that are available. Some of them tie into the provincial grants, so they might overlap. So you can see on the top left, it says Ontario Job Grant, grants to cover employee training in Ontario. You might find that overlaps with the, that's obviously a provincial grant, but there are different federal grants. So if you look at, I don't know, the third row at the second column, funding to diversify the economy in Southern Ontario, that's Federal Development Ontario, Women Entrepreneurship Strategy Ecosystem Fund, money for nonprofits to support women-led businesses. So there's all these different kinds of initiatives that are there. And I'm happy to provide a link to this after the session as well to CASA, but it's very easy to find. If you just type in Business Benefits Finder, Federal Government of Canada, you should be able to get to this tool and see what you're seeing on the screen right now in the presentation. Okay, now moving on to COVID-19 related benefits and new benefits, and just to reference the slides that I covered previously, we were talking a bit about, some of those did include businesses that were making efforts to address the COVID-19 pandemic, but a lot of those grants were available prior to the pandemic. So they're not really specific to the pandemic, and they weren't in response to the pandemic. They were pre-existing prior to the pandemic. But the ones I will cover right now are specific to the COVID-19 pandemic, and in a way they're in response to the pandemic. So moving on to the next slide, you'll see this is, first we'll cover Ontario, so provincial support that's been extended to businesses, and in particular, as you'll see, a lot of them are addressed to small businesses. So I won't cover all of them in the interest of time, but you'll see that all of, they're all hyperlinked there. And I personally think that the Ontario government's website, it's pretty interactive. It's pretty easy to use. It's easy to navigate. So if you click on any one of those links, you'll see what the eligibility criteria is. But the reason why I would recommend actually using this website is because I found that during the span of the pandemic, the grants have changed, and you've had, along with various other things. So I think it's very important to kind of keep up with the times, and I always find that the provincial website is up to date. So you'll see, even in number 5, it says Ontario Small Business Support Grant applications now closed, right? You won't be wasting your time that way trying to, apply for a grant that's already closed. So I find this to be a good place to go to keep tabs of what's open and what's currently closed. So just to give you an example, you'll see the COVID-19 Small Business Relief Grant. That particular grant is for $10,000 for small businesses that were required to close. The eligibility criteria is that they must have operated an eligible business in Ontario that closed indoor operations as a result of the province's restrictions, and they began operating prior to 2022 and were active as of January 14th, 2022. There's also other eligibility criteria. So what I'm saying is not all inclusive. It's a long list, but it's actually for specific industry. So that's what I meant earlier when I said that it kind of depends on what specific industry your business would fall under. So for example, indoor meetings and businesses that run operations where they're offering indoor meetings or event spaces, indoor performing arts venues and cinemas, etc. And then there's also another grant up there, Ontario Business Costs. It's actually a rebate program, pardon me. So it's Ontario Business Costs Rebate Program. It's for businesses that are most impacted by provincial public health measures in response to the Omicron variant. So this is what I meant when I said that it's quickly changing, and the government's kind of responding or trying to respond fairly quickly to certain changes that are happening. So Omicron, we saw that spike later in the later term of last year, and so this specific rebate program was in response to the Omicron variant. And it's for eligible businesses that were required to close or reduce capacity. They would have a certain portion of their property tax and their energy costs. They would receive a rebate for those. And the rebate in particular would be for 50% of their costs, just to kind of give you an example. So each grant is different, and it covers different things. Some of them are rebates, some of them are subsidies, some of them are grants. Some of them have certain conditions and different eligibility criteria. So you really have to kind of click on each hyperlink and see what the eligibility criteria is and whether you'd fall under that. Now, moving on to the next slide, we'll chat a little bit about the federal equivalent. So you'll see there's certain support for people. So the reason I decided to put this on the slide is, if you've got employees working for you, and they're not able to work as a result of, COVID, either they're caring for somebody who has COVID, or you are in a position where you have to lock down because you are, we're hitting another variant, right? There's another spike. You can point your employees to this specific support for people, which is on the left-hand side of the slide. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see the support for businesses. So you'll see wage and hiring support, rent and property expenses support, etc. So there's, you'll see that there's lots of support. The wage and hiring support is it's a subsidy essentially offered to cover a part of a business's employee wages, and that's to try to protect as much as possible businesses or business owners from having to terminate employees or lay them off for a significant period of time. So it's to kind of help them retain their employees. And another example is the rent and property expenses support, which is a subsidy to cover part of your commercial rent or property expenses as a business owner. These categories may also be changing. In the earlier days of the pandemic, we were hearing of other types of subsidies that were more specific per se. I can't recall off the top of my head, but I do recall, earlier on there was a different set of grants or subsidies. So that's why I think the federal government and the provincial government website are probably the best places to go to see what's available currently. Now, moving on to the next slide, we'll talk briefly a bit about vaccine mandates. And, it is an area that's definitely hard to wrap your head around. I can tell you for a fact, employment lawyers in Ontario and even across the country are struggling to keep up with, what's allowed and what's not allowed. And, a lot of the advice that employment lawyers and lawyers at large provide is based on legislation in part, as well as developing case law. So, sometimes you have to wait for a case to actually make it to the courts in Ontario, and then for a judge to actually opine on a particular matter. And that will then form part of our law in Ontario. So legislation has been fairly silent on the matter. And so that's why I say that it's a rapidly changing time, because we're deciding one way or the other. But that's why I think specifically for this area, I think it's very important to talk to an employment lawyer to see what options are. Moving on to the next slide, you'll see that there's, this is just to kind of give you an example of how quickly things have been changing. This is just a brief timeline of vaccine related mandates, and certainly it doesn't capture everything that has happened from March 2020 onwards up to date. It's just a little snapshot just to give you an idea of how how quickly times are changing. And as of March 1st, 2022, Ontario no longer requires businesses to check proof of vaccination to enter into settings. But you can see that, on October 6, 2021, the Government of Canada announced that federal public servants in the core public administration, including members of the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, were required to be vaccinated against COVID-19 by a certain date, and that was November 15th, 2021. And then, there were certain other developments. On November 3rd, the Government of Canada announced that as early as November 15th, 2021, public servants who refuse to disclose their status or who are unwilling to be fully vaccinated will be placed on administrative leave without pay. So that was in reference to federal public servants. So moving on to the next slide, I guess the question becomes, where does this leave us? What can employers actually do, specifically employers who are, business owners? What can they do at the moment? What are they supposed to do at the moment? So the short answer, and again, I caution you to obviously get specific advice tailored to your specific situation. But speaking very briefly and very generally, an employer cannot automatically impose a vaccine mandate for non-unionized employees unless there is some sort of mandate issued by the federal or the provincial government that regulates that particular industry and states that that industry must be vaccinated. So for example, just a few seconds ago, we saw when we were looking at the timeline of vaccine related mandates, we saw that there was this mandate issued by the federal government that said that RCMP officers who are federally regulated must be vaccinated. So that would be an example where somebody who is, that's a very specific example, but let's say there were other federal industries, federally regulated industries that, may not have been obviously the RCMP or as big as the RCMP, but maybe a business owner that was that fell within federally regulated industries. If they had a mandate by the government to have that industry fully vaccinated, then they would be well within their right to issue some sort of a policy that kind of governs that. But generally speaking, so that's a specific exception that I was kind of making a couple of moments ago, but generally speaking, a policy that attempts to force vaccinations may potentially be illegal due to discrimination on the basis of perceived disability. Now, some of you might be wondering, what does that mean? In Ontario, there's a key piece of legislation called the Ontario Human Rights Code, and that addresses certain, or it lists out certain grounds. We call them grounds. They're essentially categories under which certain employees are protected. So, though the categories can include age, disability, gender, sex, marital status, family status, race, etc. The list goes on. But the idea, the takeaway is that if you fall within any of those categories, the employer cannot subject you to differential treatment and cannot discriminate against you. So one of the big issues with enforcing vaccines or making them mandatory is that you could potentially be trying to impose vaccines on someone who, either cannot get vaccinated on the basis of health or medical concerns. Maybe it's, maybe they have some kind of underlying medical concerns that are going to get exacerbated if they were to get the vaccination. And that is what we are seeing as a major reason for employees refusing to get vaccinated. Another reason that we are seeing is, our religious reasons. Employees saying that they, they due to their religious beliefs, they're refusing to get vaccinated. There's a wide ranging, there's different reasons that are kind of getting brought up, but you want to make sure that you deal with each situation on a case-by-case scenario, because that's exactly what it is. There's no one size fits all. But the bottom line is, if the provincial or federal government that regulates that particular industry within which your business is operating has mandated vaccines for that particular sector, then a vaccination policy may be considered legal. But that's why I'm kind of, reiterating that you have to get specific advice, because there's so many questions that come into play, right? What sector are you operating under? What industry are you? Are you federally regulated? Are you provincially regulated? What's the particular reason that the employee is refusing to get vaccinated? All of these questions have to be answered in order for you to determine what it is you can do or can't do. So these are some common questions that we have been seeing in the ever-changing employment law landscape. Can you get fired for refusing to get vaccinated? The short answer, and again, caveat, you want to get specific advice, but the short answer is that a company cannot fire someone for cause if they refuse to get vaccinated. Without boring you with the legal details too much, what that means is, there's two ways somebody can get terminated. You can either terminate someone as a business owner for cause. That means that you're saying that there was some sort of misconduct on their part for which you are terminating them, or you can terminate them without cause, which means that you are saying there's nothing in particular that you're relying on, but you still decide to, you just want to terminate that person. And it's a misunderstanding amongst a lot of people in Ontario that you can't, sometimes people think that you can't be terminated if you haven't done anything wrong. That's false. You can get terminated, but what must happen is that the employer has to provide you with the appropriate termination pay. So that's where you want to obviously get a lawyer involved and see whether you as a business owner are, what your obligations are in terms of providing that termination pay, or on the flip side, if you are the one getting terminated, what your rights are in that circumstance. But I wrote here specifically that the company cannot fire someone for cause, which means that they can't say that, hey, you didn't get vaccinated, so we're terminating you, and we're taking the position that we're terminating you for cause, so we're not giving you anything in terms of termination entitlements. Can you be placed on an unpaid leave of absence if you refuse to get vaccinated? The short answer is likely not, because there is a basic principle in employment law that your employer cannot unilaterally change a significant portion of your employment without your consent. So if you've been working totally fine for many years, and then suddenly your employer decides to place you on an unpaid leave, you may have grounds to claim what's known as a constructive dismissal in Ontario. Now, a disclaimer again, this is a constantly changing landscape, so advice from employment lawyers across the province is varying for that reason. So you may find there's all sorts of decisions that are coming out where some judges are saying, that some judges are finding that someone who questioned mandate or a policy imposed by their employer, or people who got terminated as a result of not getting vaccinated, some judges may hold one way, other judges may hold another way. So it's a unique issue, and an issue that we didn't kind of see in the past to this extent. So I would say that, it's a small little caveat that there's wide-ranging advice that we're seeing from even, just employment lawyers across the province. So it's constantly changing. I think it's going to take maybe a year or two for us to get settled law on the topic, but for now, it's very nuanced. It's context specific, and it depends on the particular situation. So that concludes my presentation. I hope it was of some benefit, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Saba, for your presentation. It was very helpful and informative. Just 2 questions. So what actions have been taken or will be taken to address challenges and advocate for support for South Asian businesses and business owners specifically? And my second question is, obviously, we've seen recent changes to vaccine mandates that you have talked about. If business owners still want to enforce mass and proof of vaccination, what are some policies that are there that they can do this legally?
Yes, thank you for that, Nimra. So I'll actually take your second question first, which is pertaining, just because we were recently on that topic of vaccine mandates. So there is another key piece of legislation that I didn't cover, which is the Ontario Health and Safety Act, or the Occupational Health and Safety Act specifically. So that pertains to employers, so somebody potentially running businesses who hires employees. And the idea of that legislation is to ensure that employers are maintaining a healthy and safe work environment. And the reason I bring that up is because a lot of employers are issuing vaccine mandate policies under the realm of that piece of legislation, because they're saying that they have an obligation to maintain a healthy and safe work environment. And for that reason, whoever they're employing, they need to ensure that they are vaccinated. And so we're seeing a lot of employers actually at the outset in the employment agreement at the time of hiring employees are including a specific condition in there and saying that, you must be vaccinated. But like I said, it's, there's such differing opinions on it, because you may, if that employment agreement goes to somebody who cannot get vaccinated for medical reasons, you may potentially have a human rights violation there, because you are essentially disqualifying them from accepting a position or accepting a role because they have a disability. That's what it kind of boils down to, right? So you have to be very careful, and you have to get very specific advice. So you may, and it kind of depends on the industry or sector as well. So you really have to ask yourself as a business owner, is this an industry where I can actually mandating a vaccine policy trumps other considerations? So for example, personal support workers, right? That's just an example where, the nature of the business, where you have individuals that are going into the homes of very vulnerable individuals, the elderly, people who might have underlying health conditions. Can you mandate vaccine policies for them? And, like I said, a lot of employment lawyers are advising that you can, because you as a business do have an obligation to maintain a healthy and safe work environment. And whether your employees are vaccinated or not vaccinated goes to the heart of your business when you're engaging with such a vulnerable sector of the population. But for example, if you're running, I don't know, another business where you're operating remotely and all your employees are operating remotely, it may not be as reasonable to impose a vaccine mandate. So it really depends on the nature of the business. If you're supported, and if you've got backing from the federal or provincial government, if it relates to, insofar as it relates to mandating vaccinations, then you can certainly rely on that and have a vaccine policy, or create a vaccine policy with the help of a lawyer, get that drafted and have your employees get vaccinated. But you may, what I'm trying to say is you may, you may have some sort, you may face a lawsuit if you do have employees that don't want to get vaccinated for whatever reason. And then it might just become a question of whether you have enough grounds to support that vaccine policy or that vaccine mandate. And now moving on to the other question that you had, which was in relation to the advocacy that's being had for South Asian business owners. I don't know if I've specifically seen advocacy for South Asian business owners in particular. Like I've said, I've seen it I've seen advocacy sort of broadly, and I've seen, like some elements of lobbying. So business owners lobbying the government, or, writing articles, or being, contacting media outlets, being in the media widely, talking about how the pandemic is affecting them, how another lockdown will not be sustainable for their business. So there are different channels through which business owners have been advocating for themselves. But in recent times, I don't know if I've seen advocacy for the South Asian community in particular.
Thank you so much for your responses, Saba, and for your presentation for today. We have learned a lot from today's webinar. For anyone that's watching, please feel free to send any questions or comments that you may have for our speaker. And that would be all for today's session. Thank you.
Thank you so much.